Ever feel like learning should be more, well, more alive,
Yeah.
more connected to the real world, and maybe less like just a static collection of facts? If you've ever wished education really prepared you for life, not just tests, then get ready for maybe an aha moment.
Yeah.
Because today, we're taking a deep dive into a classic text that proposed exactly that, John Dewey's The School and Society.
Yeah, and this work, it started as lectures back in 1899, then updated in 1915, but it's so much more than just dry educational theory. What's really fascinating is how Dewey looked at the massive social changes happening around him, the Industrial Revolution, and he just connected them directly to how our schools needed to transform. He saw this deep link, between society and the individual child in learning.
Right. So our mission today is to unpack Dewey's insights, which are actually still surprisingly relevant. We're exploring how he saw education not as this, separate bubble, but as a living, breathing part of your world. We'll dig into how hands-on activities, these occupations, can ignite learning, how real discipline emerges, and why connecting subjects to life isn't just, a nice extra, it's fundamental. And all our insights today are coming from a revised edition of his book. You can actually find it easily on Project Gutenberg. Now, you might think big shifts in education are just, fads, something new every few years. But Dewey argued that they're as inevitable as, say, the invention of the locomotive or the telegraph. Why did he see them as so fundamental?
Well, he saw them as a direct product of changed social situations. It makes sense, right? I mean, think about the Industrial Revolution. It was this huge, rapid upheaval. It reshaped everything where people lived, moved them to cities, changed daily habits, spurred science. It even affected moral and religious ideas. Education couldn't just stand still. It had to adapt to meet the needs of this completely new society.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. Dewey takes us back, just a few generations before his time, back when the household was the absolute center of industry. I mean, picture a family not just buying clothes, but literally making them, shearing the sheep, spinning the wool, using the loom, or, the whole painstaking process of making candles from animal fat. It's a totally different world.
Exactly. And in that world, children were just naturally brought into these processes as they grew up. It wasn't treated like chores, not really. It was direct personal participation in the whole cycle, from the raw material to the finished thing. And this gave them this continuous sort of natural training in observation, ingenuity, thinking constructively, logical thought, and maybe most importantly, a really strong sense of reality from touching and working with actual materials, with nature. The educational force of the spinning wheel in the home, the local sawmill, the gristmill, it was just always there, part of life.
But now, fast forward to his time, with factories, industrial concentration, this intense division of labor, those learning opportunities just vanish from the home, practically. So if kids aren't doing that anymore, what exactly did Dewey think was lost when we took those household and neighborhood activities out of their daily lives?
Well, Dewey argues that losing those practical, integrated experiences meant the traditional school of his day became totally cut off from life, fundamentally isolated. He paints this really stark picture, doesn't he? Rows of ugly desks placed in geometrical order, everything set up for listening with very little place for the child to work. It was basically an environment built for passive absorption, where the teacher or the textbook just dictates what gets poured in.
Yeah, it's like that biologist trying to reconstruct a whole dinosaur from just one bone. You see those desks and you immediately know the only kind of activity that could happen there. Very passive, very dependent. And he points out it was all set up for handling as large numbers of children as possible, just treating them as a block, a mass.
Mm-hmm. And that uniformity, it went right through the whole system. Curriculum, teaching methods, everything made it super hard to adapt to different kids, different abilities, different interests. The whole point became just covering a fixed amount of stuff. Ready-made results and accomplishments. He even mentioned that story from Matthew Arnold about thousands of French kids all studying the exact same lesson at the exact same moment. That, Dewey said, was the core problem. In this old education, the center of gravity is outside the child. It's all external.
Okay, so we've talked about what was lost, what the old system looked like, but what was Dewey's big idea for the new way? He called it a Copernican revolution, which, that sounds pretty dramatic for education. What did he actually mean by that?
Oh, it is dramatic. Think about it like flipping the whole educational universe. Traditionally, the curriculum, the facts, the teacher, they were the sun, the center. Dewey basically said, nope, the child is the sun. All the tools of education, all the subjects, the methods, they should revolve around the child's own natural curiosity and their activities.
Ah, okay. So instead of just pouring information into a supposedly empty child, you're trying to build this rich world around them for them to explore. It's almost like looking at a kid when they're really genuinely engaged at home, maybe building something or asking questions, and then thinking, okay, how do we capture that kind of active learning in a school?
Precisely. It's about recognizing that children aren't, empty buckets waiting to be filled. They're already intensely active, already exploring, already doing things. So education isn't really about making them learn. It's about giving direction and richness to the things they're already driven to do. It means prioritizing living first and letting the learning kind of flow naturally from and in relation to that living. It's a huge shift from passive receiving to active doing.
That clicks. It really does.
Yeah.
And I guess this is where Dewey brings in these occupations you mentioned: manual training, shop work, household arts, things like that. When he uses that word occupations, is he just talking about like vocational training, preparing kids for jobs?
Yeah.
Or is there something deeper going on?
That's a really key distinction. No, definitely not vocational training, not in that narrow, like, get a job sense. For Dewey, an occupation is more like a way of doing things that mirrors or runs parallel to some kind of work that happens out in social life. Its real value, psychologically, is keeping a balance between the thinking side and the doing side, the intellectual and the practical. So yes, it's active, it involves your hands, your body, but it also demands constant observation of materials, constant planning, thinking things through. The real goal is the growth that happens in that back and forth between ideas and action, not just the thing you make at the end.
Right, the process itself is the point. So can you give us a concrete example? How did this actually work in his experimental school?
Yeah, he gives this great example of textile work, sewing and weaving. Kids wouldn't just read about textiles. They'd start with the raw stuff: flax, cotton, wool straight off the sheep. They'd actually handle it, study how it could be used, compare cotton and wool fibers. And what's really cool is that the kids, just by trying it, they figured out for themselves why the cotton industry developed so late, because getting those seeds out of cotton fiber by hand is incredibly hard. Apparently, they worked for half an hour and got less than an ounce. Suddenly, it made perfect sense why their ancestors wore wool.
Wow. So they weren't just being told about spinning. They were basically having to, like, reinvent the early steps themselves through trial and error. That feels completely different.
It is. They actually redevised simple ways to draw out and wind the fiber. Then they traced how that evolved historically all the way up to the modern loom and how that changed society. So this one activity, it naturally weaves together science understanding fibers, where they come from, the physics of the tools, and history, how humans figure things out over time. Dewey even suggests you can almost concentrate the history of all mankind into the evolution of the flax, cotton, and wool fibers into clothing. It's a big claim, but you see his point.
That's amazing. Okay, so if these hands-on occupations build ingenuity and persistence, it sounds like Dewey had a totally different take on discipline. We usually think of discipline as, I don't know, memorizing boring facts or doing repetitive drills. What was his angle?
His angle was that real discipline comes from life itself, from engaging with real tasks. If a child genuinely wants to make, say, a box, they have to plan, measure, choose the right wood, figure out how to join it, overcome problems when things go wrong. That whole process, because it's driven by their own goal, it naturally develops patience, persistence, ingenuity. And they learn stuff along the way, practical knowledge. Or his example with kids cooking eggs. It wasn't just follow the recipe. When the teacher plumped them, they actually got interested and willingly experimented to understand why heat affects albumin the way it does. He called this realizing an impulse, by grappling directly with facts and conditions. That leads to deeper understanding and, crucially, self-regulation, which is a much more profound kind of discipline than just, doing what you're told or memorizing things by rote.
Moving beyond just the classroom, Dewey also talks about an intellectual revolution that was kind of sparked by the industrial one. Things like printing, the locomotive, the telegraph, huge technological shifts. How did he see those changing how we learn, or maybe how we should be learning?
Well, those inventions completely blew the doors off access to knowledge, didn't they? Suddenly, knowledge wasn't locked away in rare manuscripts, only for some, high priesthood of learning, this exclusive scholarly class. It became, as he put it, liquefied. It could flow actively through society, which basically made a separate, distinctively learned class kind of irrelevant, an anachronism. And yet he noticed traditional education was still stuck in this almost medieval conception of learning, still focused purely on piling up information and symbols. It wasn't tapping into our basic human impulses to make, to do, to create, and this just reinforced that old split between so-called cultured people and workers.
Okay, so if we peel back the layers of traditional schooling, the textbooks, the rote learning, what did Dewey see as the fundamental, the really innate ways children are just wired to learn? He identified 4 main drivers, right?
Right.
He did, yeah. He called them the child's four natural resources. The basic impulses that education should be building on. First, there's the social instinct. You see it in conversation, communication, just interacting with others. He famously called language the greatest of all educational resources. Second, the constructive impulse. That basic urge kids have to make things, to build, whether it's through play or making actual tangible objects. And this, he said, combined with conversation, naturally leads to investigation. Kids just like to do things and watch to see what will happen. Third, the expressive impulse, or you could call it the art instinct. This is sort of a refinement of communication and construction. When making something is done well and has a social purpose, it becomes art. Think about kids' drawings. He mentioned examples like a cave in trees or hand spinning, how they evolve from simple marks to more observed, more imaginative work as kids learn more. And fourth, the instinct of inquiry, finding things out. This grows right out of the making and talking impulses. It's that drive to ask why and how.
That makes a lot of sense. It feels very grounded in how kids actually are. Can you give us another example of how these impulses might all come together in a real learning situation?
Sure. Dewey talks about these 7-year-olds who got really interested in folks and their doings, basically how people lived long ago. So they started imagining primitive life. And that led them to actually testing different stones and woods to see what would make good primitive weapons. Boom, an immediate hands-on mineralogy and materials science lesson. Or another time they were discussing the Iron Age and they decided, hey, let's build a smelting oven. Their first design didn't work. The drafts were wrong. But that failure created a real need to understand combustion principles. So the instruction came then, driven by their problem, and they figured it out experimentally. It wasn't just handed to them. And in doing that, they naturally pulled in science, geography, anthropology, ending up, as Dewey put it, with infinitely more acquaintance with facts than if they'd just read about it, because they owned the problem.
Okay, shifting gears a bit, Dewey says something pretty strong. All waste is due to isolation.
Oh.
And he's clearly talking about more than just wasting money, right? He calls it the waste of human life. That sounds
True.
intense.
It is intense. And yeah, the primary waste he's talking about is the potential of the children themselves. Their lives being hampered by, his words, inadequate and perverted preparation for the world they actually live in. And he argues this waste comes directly from isolation, different parts of the school system being cut off from each other. Kindergarten separate from primary, primary from grammar, the university looking down on the normal school where teachers were trained. He even used charts, apparently, to show how these different parts grew up historically with totally different aims, and so they just stayed disconnected. Like you'd have normal schools focused only on how to teach, while universities focused only on what to teach sometimes, he said, with almost a contempt for methods of teaching. And this fragmentation, it hurts everyone. Teachers aren't prepared properly, universities are disconnected from schools, and ultimately the students suffer from this lack of coherence.
Right. So if isolation is the big problem, what was Dewey's solution? How do you unite the system and bridge all those gaps?
Simple but profound. The solution, he said, is to unite each to life. Connect every part of the school back to the larger whole of social life. There needs to be free-flowing interaction between the school and the home, the natural environment, the world of business and work, even the university. That famous example he gave the kids in Moline, Illinois, who were studying the Mississippi River in their geography textbook, but didn't make the connection that it was the same actual river flowing right past their town. That just perfectly illustrates that tragic gap between school learning and real, everyday experience.
Wow, yeah, that's a stark image. So, based on this idea of connecting everything to life, what would Dewey's ideal school actually look like?
He pictured a school where the building itself almost physically swelled out to make these connections. So imagine a school, but it has proper kitchens, dining rooms, wood shops, metal shops, textile rooms. These are the practice corners, the places for doing. But then at the center, maybe physically or maybe metaphorically, you'd have the library. This represents the theory behind the practical activities. It's where you find the intellectual resources to understand and enrich the hands-on work. And the idea is constant back and forth. The child brings home experiences to school and applies school learning at home. Cooking, for example, isn't just learning a recipe. It becomes a natural doorway into botany, where do ingredients come from, and chemistry, what happens when you heat things, what's albumin. You trace materials back to the soil, you understand processes. The workshops connect naturally to physics, to commerce, maybe to art, even to university engineering departments. It provides that real-world context.
Okay, and what about the upper story of this ideal school? How did labs and art studios fit into this picture?
Right, the upper story would house the laboratories and art studios. So problems or questions that bubble up from the kitchen or the shop, like why does the spinning wheel work this way, or why did my smelting oven fail? Those get taken up to the labs for more focused, deeper investigation. And art, crucially, isn't something tacked on from the outside, like a totally separate subject. It's seen as the natural culmination, the idealization of all the practical work. He pointed to the Renaissance, where the great art grew directly out of the crafts, the manual arts. He imagined a textile room, for instance, not just as a place to sew, but as a kind of pictured museum, full of different materials, tools through history, historical examples, maybe literary connections. He mentions Penelope in the Odyssey, weaving even music related to it. A true synthesis of art, science, industry, history.
So if you set things up that way, the whole problem of subjects being isolated from each other just kind of dissolves.
Exactly. When the school is organically tied to life, all studies are of necessity correlated, because they all just arise naturally from different facets of the one earth and the one life lived upon it. The single unifying aim then becomes the child's overall growth in the direction of social capacity and service, developing a larger and more vital union with life. And things like discipline, culture, information, they stop being separate goals and just naturally fall into place as different aspects of this holistic growth.
It really sounds like Dewey's whole philosophy was built on a fundamentally different view of the child's mind than what was common then. Almost revolutionary, really, in how he saw kids learning.
Oh, absolutely. He directly challenged the dominant psychology of his time. That view saw the mind as this purely individual affair, like a fixed thing already equipped with separate faculties, memory, judgment, attention, whatever. Dewey, though, influenced by newer psychology and the whole idea of evolution, saw the individual mind as a function of social life, something that's constantly developing, constantly changing through interaction. And that means education isn't about trying to force-fit a child into some rigid, pre-planned curriculum like that old weird idea of assigning one continent to each grade, regardless of the kid's actual development. Instead, it's about providing the proper nutrition, as he put it, for the child's dominant interests and ways of acting at a given period. You adapt to where they are developmentally.
That makes so much more sense. Okay, so how does this new psychology, this idea of an evolving socially shaped mind, play out in how children develop attention? He talked about different levels, didn't he?
He did, yeah. He identified three main types. For young kids, say 4 to 8 years old, you see mostly spontaneous attention. They just get completely absorbed in what they're doing. No conscious effort needed. Think of a kid lost in play. Then, in middle childhood, maybe 8 to 12, you start seeing more indirect or voluntary attention. This is where they focus on something, maybe something less interesting in itself because it helps them achieve a goal they do care about. The focus isn't purely on the activity, but on the desired result.
But the highest form, the goal really, is what he called reflective attention proper. What exactly did he mean by that one?
So reflective attention proper, that's the highest form. It's when the child, or the learner, actively engages with a problem. They start entertaining results, but in the form of questions, problems they need to solve for themselves. That's genuine intellectual progress. The old school often failed here, Dewey thought, because it just assumed you could force attention or bribe kids into paying attention, which only leads to this kind of partial, externally driven learning focused on memorizing ready-made answers someone else figured out. True reflective attention involves judging, reasoning, deliberation. The problem becomes your own problem. The motivation comes from within. And the training you get isn't just learning facts, it's a gain in power of control, developing a habit of actually thinking through problems. It's about building that inner capacity to figure things out.
Okay, so if the ultimate goal is that kind of deep, engaged problem-solving learning, how does Dewey rethink a traditional subject like history? Is it just memorizing stuff about the past?
Not at all. Not for Dewey. For the educator, history needs to be thought of as indirect sociology. It's really a study of how society became what it is, how it got organized. The key is to make it moving, dynamic, to understand how and why people did things the way they did, not just what they did. And he really emphasizes the economic and industrial side of history, because that's where you see most clearly how humanity learned to, master and use nature, and how intelligence developed through solving real-world problems. That's the real engine of history for him.
So much less about just memorizing dates and kings and battles, and way more about understanding human ingenuity, how societies evolved, how we solve problems. What about chronological order, though? Should kids start way back with, like, ancient Babylon just because it happened first?
Dewey argued pretty strongly against that, especially for young children. He said we should deal with what is near in spirit, Not just what's chronologically ancient, but maybe totally unrelatable. His school actually experimented with a three-stage approach to history. First, for the younger kids, maybe 6 to 8, it was generalized and simplified. They'd explore typical human occupations across time, how inventions evolve, like the whole textile thing we talked about, big movements like migration, exploration. It gives a broad sense of social activity without getting bogged down in specific names and dates yet. Then second, for maybe 8 to 12-year-olds, it became local and specific. The focus shifts to the definite activities of particular groups of people. They'd often start with American history, especially colonial life, because that usually connects most directly to the child's own environment and the previous stage. And only then, third, maybe in later grades, would they approach differentiated types in a more chronological way, examining specific nations or periods for their unique contributions to the bigger story of world history. This whole progression lets kids build understanding gradually and see history as this living, relevant force, not just a pile of disconnected facts from long ago.
Okay, and finally, what about the bedrock? The three R's, reading, writing, arithmetic. These are usually seen as the absolute non-negotiables. Did Dewey see them as less important, maybe secondary to these occupations?
He saw them as incredibly important, absolute foundational social tools, no question about that. But he insisted they need to be introduced when the child's own personal and vital experience creates a genuine need for them. So, if children are engaged in meaningful activities, trying to solve real problems, they'll naturally hit points where they feel an intellectual hunger, a need to communicate more clearly, or measure something accurately, or find information in a book. That's the moment to introduce reading, writing, numbers. Because then the symbols have immediate meaning and purpose. They aren't just abstract things to memorize, becoming, as he worried, secondhand substitutes for reality. And apparently, in his school, this approach actually led to a considerable reduction of the time ordinarily devoted to them compared to traditional schools. But he claimed the kids' final use of these symbols was more intelligent, less mechanical, more active, less passively receptive. They became powerful tools for discovery, not just hoops to jump through.
So, wrapping up our deep dive into Dewey's The School and Society, it really paints this picture of education that's so much less like a factory, churning out knowledge, and much more about cultivating a whole person dynamic, engaged, connected. We've seen how he brilliantly links these huge global shifts like industrialization right down to the best way for an individual child to learn, which is through tackling real problems and understanding how their own actions fit into the bigger social picture.
Yeah, it's such a powerful reminder, isn't it, that life is the great thing after all, as he said. He really believed that if we just align education with the real natural instincts and needs of childhood, if we foster its fullest growth and expression, then all the other stuff, the discipline, the information, the culture we value in adult life, shall all come in their due season. His core message, I think, is that the school shouldn't be separate from life. It should be a miniature community, an embryonic society, a place where the goal is the growth of the imagination in flexibility, in scope, and in sympathy, until the life the individual child lives is really deeply informed with the life of nature and of society. It's about connection.
That's a great way to put it. So if true learning really is about actively living and connecting with the world around us, not just passively absorbing facts, maybe here's a thought to leave you with.
Yeah.
What small experiment could you maybe conduct in your own daily life this week to truly try and live and learn something new? Not from a book, but from doing, from engaging directly.